Tariq, so help us understand Egypt's sort of basic orientation, because generally speaking, people have tended to view Egypt as a country that in some sense has been part of the containment of Hamas. It was enforcing the blockade in various ways over the last 16 years. It doesn't let Palestinians in. How has it reacted to this attack, the Hamas attack?
Thanks. Great question. Thanks for having me, Fareed. It's good to be with you despite the quite catastrophic circumstances. So look, the Egyptian reaction to what happened on October 7th is very plain. They've been calling since day one for a ceasefire. You know, one of the, I think, problems, and I think Nick Kristof mentioned this in your earlier segment, is that we've kind of blown past the horrors of October 7th. The Egyptians moved past the horrors of October 7th almost immediately because they felt that they could see what was coming down the pike, which was a massive retaliation operation by the Netanyahu government in Gaza that would yield a humanitarian crisis of incredible proportions, and that would put Egypt under a great deal of pressure. So Egypt, from the very beginning, has been calling for a ceasefire. They've been calling for restraint. They convened, remember, a peace conference in October that didn't yield anything, but was a pretty clear demonstration of what Egyptian intentions were. The Egyptians today are trying to negotiate, along with the Qataris, with Hamas to get a ceasefire in exchange for the release of some hostages.
But there are a lot of people who think the Egyptian government tends to play this game of public support, but privately they kind of want Israel to destroy Hamas.
I think if the Israelis could invent a weapon that would only target Hamas members and leave the people of Gaza and the infrastructure of Gaza intact, I'm sure the Egyptians would sign on to it. But the Egyptians know there isn't such a thing. And if you look at Egyptian conduct, if you look at their public statements, they've constantly been telling the Israelis, be careful, stop. If you look at the statements of the Egyptian Foreign Ministry, if you even look at the statements of President Sisi, they have been calling for restraint, and I think they're calling for it publicly, and they're calling for it behind closed doors.
But Sisi has been known, for example, to be very tough on, versions of Hamas in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood, for example, I mean, tens of thousands of its members are jailed. Is he doing this because public opinion in Egypt is very strongly now pro-Palestinian?
Absolutely, public opinion in Egypt is very pro-Palestinian, but the Egyptian government didn't come from Mars, right? The Egyptian government emerges from the Egyptian people, and almost without exception, Egyptian officials feel a great deal of sympathy with Gazans and feel that the Israeli retaliation against Gaza, which, remember, Fareed, according to some accounts, there have been more civilians killed in Gaza in the last 6 weeks than civilian Ukrainians have been killed since February 2022. So this is a humanitarian crisis of catastrophic proportions.
So why won't the Egyptian government let Palestinians into Egypt?
A couple of reasons. If you read President Sisi's public statements, he has said, in part, that allowing Gazans into Egypt will destabilize Egypt, because suddenly now you'll have millions of people, millions of Gazans in the Sinai Peninsula, some untold number of whom might be Hamas fighters, who would then use Egypt maybe as a staging ground for their operations against Israel. And then suddenly Egypt, which since the peace treaty with Israel has been part of the solution in the region, would once again be drawn into the theater of war and be part of the problem. So Sisi is very concerned about that. The other thing he is concerned about, that he has said very publicly, and every Egyptian official you talk to will say very publicly, is that they do not want to be party to the displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, because they believe that once the Palestinians are pushed out, the Netanyahu government will never let them back in. And so there are fears, I don't know if they're credible or not credible, but they are deeply felt, that Egypt does not want to be part of what would be termed as a second Nakba, a second displacement of Palestinians from their lands.
Finally and quickly, post-conflict, there are all these discussions about an Arab force, an Arab government, a Palestinian authority. What do you think happens post-conflict?
I think that's a very difficult question. I think there's a couple of things. Some of the proposals that have been offered seem more to me like pipe dreams. The idea that Egypt and Saudi Arabia, et cetera, would come in and somehow govern Gaza instead of Hamas or instead of Israel seems unrealistic. The Egyptians have a difficult time governing themselves. I think there's also not enough attention paid to, again, the cost to Egypt of being involved in such a thing. What's that line Metternich said about France? If France sneezes, Europe catches a cold. If Egypt sneezes, the Middle East gets cancer. And so the idea that you would put Egypt in this position, which could be very destabilizing to the country, I think is one that should give us real pause. The issue in Gaza right now is once Hamas has been tamed, the issue is establishing governance. I don't know how we do that. I know how we don't do that. And that's by getting very beleaguered, weak, impoverished countries in crisis like Egypt to try to shoulder that burden.
Tariq Masood, always a pleasure.
Thank you for